Right, so welcome to podcast one of the Foresight Aerospace series. This is in preparation for the Foresight Aerospace conference, which is happening in May on the 19th. In episode one, I have with me today David Rottblatt, Business Development Director and Project Leader of EmbraerX, and Neil Cloughley, Founder and Managing Director of Faradair Aerospace. And today the discussion is really looking at the subject of COVID-19 and what happens in the post-COVID-19 world. And of course, we're looking at it from the perspective of an electric aviation world and what I refer to as sub-regional aviation activity. So a bit of a frame of reference here. We have the pre-COVID world in that the electric aviation industry was on the strong path to deliver both fixed-wing electric aircraft and eVTOL, both electric and hybrid configurations. But now with COVID, the aviation activity in the world, all around the world, has plummeted, and we're seeing losses of airlines, and there's even talk about airports potentially closing in the very near future. The other thing we're seeing is that a lot of airlines are starting to retire their older fleet of aircraft. And a lot of those older fleet tended to feed the regional routes or deliver regional services. Now, of course, as we know, regional connectivity is very important to the economies around the world. So a question has to be asked is what is going to happen if we lose that regional connectivity? And really, how do we think that electric aviation could play a role in that recovery? And additionally, how long do you guys think it's going to take? So in the first case, I'm going to ask Neil for your thoughts on the subject. Thanks.
Thanks, Darrell. Just looking at the industry per se, we've seen this before. Basically, the commercial aircraft industry goes through cycles. We actually haven't had a major downturn cyclical cycle for quite a while. Probably really post 9/11 was the last one of any real significance. We had some troubles during the financial crisis in 08, but really this has been one of the longest periods within this cyclical process where we haven't really had a major downturn. However, that said, what we've seen is an awful lot of airlines going down, and I think what we've seen is the truly thin margins that many airlines operate on. So there's a phrase of reference called dry powder. Dry powder is your financial reserves to weather things. And many airlines simply don't have it. So when they face a major problem, be it either oil pricing increase or war or terrorist event or pandemic, it hits them really, really quickly. Especially something with regard to the commercial aircraft market, whereby we've seen very clearly demonstrated that if something like this breaks out, the global air transport network takes this thing around the globe in a matter of weeks. I mean, it's that quick. If that network wasn't there, it wouldn't have spread so quickly. So we have a problem in the sense that in order to restrict that spread, we have to shut the air network down quicker from that region. And then, of course, you look at, well, what do you suspend? And when you're talking about the aircraft, of which aircraft get put down quickest, it's interesting, actually, which aircraft did go down first on the fleets. And for example, the A380 was pretty much the first aircraft across all the fleets that was parked up first, because there simply wasn't the demand for that big beast to be flying around. And that's a great shame, because that aircraft may not recover. I mean, we've got to be honest. We were already seeing airlines parking this after their 12-year operation with no secondary users. And for those who don't realize, the way the aviation market always used to work was a primary, secondary, and tertiary market. That would be sort of 10 years, 10 years, 10 years after each heavy check, which allowed you to amortize the cost of the asset over a 30-year lifespan with hopeful balloon payment of profit at the end. That model has changed radically in the last 10 years. So now we're seeing sort of asset lives of around 12 to 15 years. And we're seeing a much quicker turnover of stock. A lot of that's come down to the OEMs. The OEMs have been pumping out production levels much higher. They've been racing each other on order book volume. But the downside of that is if you are then being forced to run newer kit, that means that kit is more expensive. That means that in order to buy the latest asset, you're spending a lot of money, which means then if your margins are that thin, you really struggle. Whereas if you look at airlines like Allegiant, for example, in the US, they came into the market when everybody else had done with the MD-80. and they took the MD-80, stripped out all the galleys, stripped out everything they could possibly do out of it to make it a little bit more fuel efficient, and actually made it work. So I think what we're going to see here is a complete rethinking, and we've actually been talking to a number of airlines just recently. The future thinking now presents an opportunity. Are we now going to see a change in the model, which is, it would be lovely if we could serve every city in every country on every continent as an airline. But actually now, does that leave you exposed and at a wider risk that if you have a major problem, you now suddenly have to start parking tons of your aircraft, laying off a whole ton of staff? Whereas if we look at it differently and say, okay, well, if you are, say, instead of doing British Airways 6, 7 flights to New York in a day, you're now doing 2. Likewise, you do the same in Washington, LA, the major hubs. Do we now start going back to a model where we bring regional carriers back to bringing people to those major international hubs? So we almost go back to the older model that we used to have. Rather than everybody serving every city across every continent, now we start focusing the international carriers to do the international routes, and they can manage that more effectively with the facilities and the cash reserves and everything that they've got, allowing the regionals to come up and to start filling in some of those gaps to bring people in and out. And I mean, having been stood in a queue in immigration in San Francisco just the other month, hour and 45 minutes, you're queuing up and down, up and down. The problem with major hub international airports is they are so busy. There are so many people going through such a confined space and area that actually from a regional perspective, could we not now bring people from smaller airports, GA airports with regional aircraft? I mean, we saw the Embraer, the E2, I think it was in at Oxford Airport here in the UK. I mean, it's the largest aircraft they'd ever had in that airport, but it proved it could take off and land there quite happily. So now, are we seeing the opportunity where smaller regional aircraft, and of course hybrid electric new technology aircraft, is absolutely key for this? I mean, we can start operating in smaller airfields without disturbing the local populace, providing lift, providing that extra connectivity without all the nasty side benefits of old asset technology. So yeah, it's a real dynamic period right now. I think we're going to see a lot of change.
And how long do you think it's going to be before we start to see recovery?
From what I've seen, and I think most industry expert opinion is 18 to 24 months. Yeah. I would think. I think after 24 months, we're going to be starting to see growth and extension again. But until that time, a lot of it's batten down the hatches, survive, replan, re-coordinate, re-look at routes, assess which ones are profitable, which ones aren't. I think you're going to see an awful lot of change. We could also see some more consolidation. We may see airlines sort of getting their heads together and go, you know what, we do some code sharing stuff. Let's think about doing something a little bit more joined. So yeah, I think over the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to see an awful lot of change. Sadly, we are going to lose more airlines. Yeah, that's just going to happen. But I think those who've taken the sensible option, I mean, Austrian are an interesting one. Austrian just park the fleet. That was it. Bang, park it, furlough as many people as possible. Let's batten down the hatches and see what we can do. Others are still trying to fly, and others simply don't have a clue what the hell to do. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting period.
Okay, so in a nutshell, 18 to 24 months, and you think probably a potential resurgence of the hub and spoke model and losses of regional airlines, and this is where sub-regional electric aviation can come in to fill that gap.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, brilliant. Robert, David, your thoughts, sir, please.
So I think that one of the things that this crisis has uncovered is, I think, that the rather rigid nature of the airlines' business models. Most airlines have not shown that they can pivot very quickly from mostly being passenger-based to being able to be more Darwinian and very quickly adapt to a cargo-heavy market, which is, of course, what we need right now. We need a lot of supplies flowing around the world very quickly. There's a lot of parts of the world that rely on other distribution centers to get their stuff. For example, Hawaii. American Airlines recently sent several Boeing 777s over there just filled with food to restock basic pantries. There's not a lot that's producing the island of Hawaii, and I'm sure that that's analogous to a lot of other places around the world. So it's not just medical equipment, it's not just masks, it's the basics that we all depend on every day that we don't really think about. And so the first thing is I think that this crisis has uncovered the need for us to be able to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more elastic in how we prepare the aircraft for these shifts in the market. I think that some airlines like Austrian Airlines who have made the decision just to park have I think probably seen less hemorrhaging of money, but have also not been able to capture some of the value in Europe in terms of what the market needs for cargo solutions, and whether Austrian's network would have been able to fill that gap or no. I'm not sure, but I think that at times that could be perceived as a missed opportunity, where you could just say, okay, based on the routes that I think Europe needs in order for me to supply cargo, I can choose smaller regional aircraft like A320s, or I can keep my A330s or A340s flying. Whatever the case is, I think that it's always worth examining how can I still find value or create value for my firm. And so as a lot of experts are asking the very important question, is this virus just coming and going one time, or will it be back? Could it be as seasonal as the flu? I think that will certainly change aviation's ability to prepare and plan ahead in case this does happen again. And so hopefully, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, where we're embarking on spring and then summer, should this subside with the seasons as the flu does, and I don't know enough to know if that will happen or not. Hopefully that will give us enough time to at least be able to plan for the next wave should another wave happen. We're a little bit more prepared. We're a little bit more educated in terms of being able to see around corners for how we can repurpose the fleet and make sure that we can maximize asset utilization as much as possible for those assets that are deemed still worthy to fly. As it pertains to aircraft that are retiring, I think that, again, it's worthwhile to take a look at how those aircraft can be serving a purpose, at least in the cargo industry, if not in other industries. So I think Airbus had shown that they had repurposed some of their aircraft to be flying hospitals or even stationary hospitals. So even if the aircraft is not profitable because it's old and it's more inefficient, there's other things that we can do with these assets to still create value or provide value. And even if it's from a corporate social responsibility perspective, hey, we're doing something to chip in with what we have. That's interesting. A lot of portable hospitals have been created using different types of infrastructure just to make do. And the fuselage of an aircraft, I think, is fairly versatile in the sense that those seat configurations are always moving. Whether some carriers choose to remove their economy class completely and fill it just with business class because that's the service that they want to provide on certain routes, like from England to New York, for example, or it's just economy, like the JetBlue model. We know that these aircraft can be flexible, and some aircraft have been repurposed to be flying ICUs. Even if it's to evacuate your citizens from one country to another in the repatriation effort. So I just wanted to highlight the need that I think industry has to be a little bit more Darwinian, and I think that there's a lot of lessons that can be shared from different operators in different countries for how we can prepare should there be another wave. So that's one thing. I think that by and large the industry has done what it thinks is responsible, from first enabling social distancing on the aircraft, and then some airlines are shutting down completely, and then of course removing routes. It's never a good thing to be furloughed, and it's never a good thing to experience that need to contract and be a product of that elasticity. But the sooner that we can make sure that we can recognize the need to do that, we can prepare our employees for contingencies where they can figure out how else that they can provide for themselves. And so I think that some organizations probably were slow to react, others are very quick to react. And this is very uncharted territory. We're all navigating this ambiguous environment for the first time, so there's no playbook to go by. We're all learning at the same time. My wish is that best practices can be shared. Everyone can look back retrospectively and think how can we get ready for winter 2020 and
right.
2021. My thoughts on how we can use analytics, I think is also something interesting for this forum to discuss, for us to potentially review during the May 19 meeting. Industry 4.0 has been interesting in the sense that we've tried to use and harness data for things like preventative analytics, digital twin technology, where we recreate the asset that's moving in a digital sense, so that we can look into the future and try and see when will a part break, so that we can order that part in advance of it breaking. Telltale signs like high temps or microscopic cracks or something that we can pick up with borescope analysis. How we look into the future has really been just focused on the asset, but if we now start to incorporate environmental data like sicknesses and illnesses and viruses into our models and how we plan for the future, I think that should be an interesting way that we can continue to harness data and have that be a part of our planning exercises. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of value that the Silicon Valleys of the world can offer in terms of our ability to really step up and provide unique solutions.
Right. So you think that it's going to be about evolution in that we have to adopt our business models to take account for these types of events, whether they're recurring or new events that are happening around the world.
I do. I think it's unfortunate whenever anybody, regardless of the business model, is being reactive. And so just in my local town, a lot of the restaurants, of course, have had to figure out when they still be in business. And luckily, local laws, at least here in Massachusetts, are allowing most of those restaurants to continue to offer takeout. And so they've been very creative with how they adapt to the environment by offering curbside pickup, or some will even deliver. And for higher established restaurants that are not used to doing something like that, they're doing it to stay alive. So what I'm trying to get at here is how can we be more proactive and plan ahead and diversify the ways in which we run our businesses. And of course that'll all be a product of learning.
And how long do you think before we're going to start to return to some form of normality?
So I've heard a lot of really interesting arguments that it'll be V-shaped just as quickly as the market contracted. It will expand. Others have said it's more like a U. I tend to be a little bit more bullish than 18 to 24 months, only because we've learned to, as an industry, incentivize behavior very well. I think that hotels and airlines will partner together to offer unbeatable promotions that are too irresistible to pass up, just to get the industry back moving. And I think that while it will take a while for the hotel industry and the airline industry and the supporting services industry to be able to scale up, and perhaps that will be the brakes on the economy's ability to return as quickly as it would like. As soon as those incentives are there, I think behavior will follow. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think a lot of business has been put on hold, and a lot of companies need that cash that we weren't able to make. And so everyone has, I think, the mandate, if we're working for businesses that are in the business of making money, to do as much as we can to recoup the value that we were looking to capture this year. And so as soon as governments say it's safe, then it'll ultimately be a company by company decision. And for those companies that are really driven by those quarters, I think that we'll see people returning to the skies in order to close those deals. And so it's ultimately coming down to how we're incentivized to behave. And I think that governments have done a great job around the world. Some, I think, more proactive than others in terms of stimulating the economy, alleviating some of the burden by relaxing mortgage payments or pausing certain debt obligations. Everything from local utilities to major mortgage lenders have been cooperating in different ways. But at some point, those investors to those mortgage lenders will be asking for their money, and people will need to pay that back again. And so I think that, again, people will be incentivized to behave a certain way. And as soon as the government say it's safe to start travel, I'm betting, because of these incentives, not only for the professional commitments we have to our companies, but also because people have been cooped up for a long time. And I think they'd love to get out. Spring and summer is upon us in the Northern Hemisphere, and we can taste it, right? We can taste it looking out our window. And so I do think we will probably want to take advantage of some of those great promotions that will likely be offered. Yeah,
great. So Neil, you and I have a standing bet about how quiet the BIHA is going to be, and it's something involving a case of very expensive wine or champagne, and the default for me is a cartwheel in a kilt, I believe, or something to that effect.
I think we said skirt, but we'll go with
kilt. Kilt. Yes, I'm sure I have some Scottish heritage in there somewhere I can draw upon. When we had our conversation earlier in the week, prepping for this, we happened across this comment that you think that people are getting used to having quiet skies, and I know when I hear an airplane going overhead, I run outside, I take a look up, I get onto a website, and I go flight radar and find out who it is flying overhead. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the anti-noise campaign groups are going to gain a lot of traction? And do you think that it's going to be more difficult for us to go back to some of the same levels of aviation activities, especially at our hub airports post-COVID?
It's interesting. I've just done an op-ed piece which is about to publish on sort of my thoughts on the industry going forward and after COVID. And one of the key things, I think, and this may be controversial, but I've never shied away from that.
No.
I think the third runway at Heathrow is dead.
Oh, really?
And I'll tell you why. There was a notion once of Boris's Island. It was mocked, it was lauded as lunacy and far too expensive. What we've seen is actually, if you take a brand new build and you put it in the middle of the Thames estuary with a water link directly into the center of London, where you could have 4 runways and just really make that a state-of-the-art airport, that actually doesn't start to sound quite so crazy anymore, because we've seen that there's a big push now. We've seen that one of the greatest challenges the aviation industry is going to face now is this growing climate lobby, etc., where there's pressure, even if it's not necessarily strictly correct in its understanding of how much emissions aviation puts out there versus other industries. That is the perception. Aviation is bad. I mean, I've been at numerous events, and I was at Tortoise Media events last year, where a lot of the perception is that just aviation is bad for the environment. So what we're seeing here is something that hasn't happened for generations. This is where people who've lived around Chicago, Atlanta, Heathrow, Hammersmith, none of these people have ever known anything other than air traffic over their heads, and they've gotten used to it, and it's just daily process. For the first time, even more so since after 9/11, we are looking, as you say, at those aircraft. I mean, I did it the other day. I did exactly the same thing. I heard a big heavy going over, and I thought, what the hell's that? Checked it on flight radar. It was a Cargo Lux 747, obviously loaded to the gunnels with cargo heading out across the Atlantic. And I think people are going to notice that. They've noticed that in India, they're seeing the Himalayas that they've never seen for decades. People are noticing the lack of pollution. People near Heathrow cannot smell Jet A within 5-mile radius of the airport.
Pictures of LA.
Exactly. I mean, it's incredible. It's a real change. The next time there is an application for something, whereas before people may not have bothered to air their concerns, now I think you're going to see them throwing in their concerns in a big way, because they like it. Yeah. They like it being quieter. They like it being cleaner. So what does that mean? Well, actually, there's an opportunity there. And I know it's weird, but there is a strange loop on this, which is, if we were to focus on something like, let's call it Boris Island as an example, where you actually put that major international air transport into that purpose-built airport, what that means is that you now repurpose the likes of London City, Gatwick, Heathrow for more regional traffic. So now you've got aircraft like the Embraer E2 and the hybrid electric aircraft that are becoming for the future will be picking up that slot load, but they'll be doing it much quieter on a much less pervasive impact to the local environment and the local economy. Yet they're providing more service, they're providing more capability and similar levels of flights, but much quieter, cleaner, and with no objections. So that makes a ton of sense. And I think that basically what you're seeing then is a major shift for these airports to consider is, where do we go in the future? Because if they can't add a third runway, like for example Heathrow, if there is a growing angst against continuous aircraft noise and pollution, etc., then what better time than to start making that planning now? What better time than to start investing now in that technology, in those capabilities? And yeah, I mean, we've said quite clearly, our aircraft is designed to operate 24/7. It's a PAX combi convertible aircraft, which makes all the economic sense in the world, whereby once you finish using it for passenger ops during the day, the seats come out as a palletized unclip, then go the LD3 containers, and this thing flies all night because it's not going to interfere with people. But in order to do that, and in order for it to be viable, it has to have been purpose designed for the job. I mean, with our aircraft, it was designed for hybrid electric flights since we started back in 2014. We've seen umpteen people coming into the marketplace with some very sexy, very cool looking devices and things, but without the core understanding of how commercial air transport works, which is RPKs, revenue, passenger kilometer. It means we've got infrastructure that we have at the moment, which isn't going to upgrade anytime soon. So therefore, we've got to fit in with what we've got. But can we do things better? Can we do things and make better use of what we have? The GA airspace is there. It's perfectly usable. GA airfields are there, perfectly usable. Can we now start putting more air transport into those regions without people complaining about the noise, without people even recognizing that aircraft are coming on a much more regular basis? If we can do that, and the asset has been designed to do that, then it's going to absolutely take off. I mean, this is something that I think in the next 4 to 5 years, when some of these assets start hitting the ramp and people start seeing that, yeah, you can go from London to Manchester for £50 ticket, and you're not going to disturb the local residents. And everybody likes that because they get the convenience of that flight capability at a price that everybody can afford. And this is where some of the eVTOL things fall down a little bit, because what some people say is affordable, 90% of the population can't afford. So the only way you're going to do that is bums on seats. It's more passengers in your asset, and it's using existing facilities, existing air channels, air network corridors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that hybrid electric is going to be the lead in for fully electric. Of that, there is no doubt. We've been saying that for 6 years now. And I think that as and when the technology for fully electric starts maturing and we start getting the reliability levels that are required for certification, then we're going to start migrating to that fully electric future. And then it starts getting really interesting. But no, I think that there is some interesting opportunity here, and there is a lot of change. And yeah, I think it's going to affect a lot of airports and how they think and how they future plan now.
Right. So you think that a post-COVID-19 world could really accelerate the rollout of an electric aviation world?
Why not?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, why not? What a perfect time to do it. If now is the time where people have got to be thinking. I mean, I remember talking to airlines back in my commercial aviation days, and you'd be looking at sort of 2-3 years ahead, what you're going to be doing on the fleet, which retirements of the fleet were coming out, etc. Now I think we're looking at something that, and I asked this, I remember at the very first hybrid electric aircraft conference in Germany back in 2015 that I did a moderation on panel. And I asked the guys at the time, I said, where are we going to be in 5 years' time? And it was a question that really stumped a lot of people, because we always tend to talk about what's happening in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years' time. Half of us are going to be dead in 40 years' time. I mean, there's no point even talking about it.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, okay. What are we actually going to achieve in 5 years? And I think this is the real opportunity here and now, is if we can bring the industry together and we can start saying, okay, we know that in 5 years' time, we want to deliver this. And at the moment, there is just a tad too much competition amongst certain environments, whereby the funding that's available ends up in certain channels that we know. We need to start spreading that more. We need to start working with the people who've seen this market, seen the opportunity, and start saying, okay, well, let's set that 5-year goal. Let's say, where are we going to be in 5 years from now? In 2025, what are we going to deliver? And then what are we going to be in 2030? And just hit these milestones, because everything keeps moving and bunching and shifting depending on whether you've got the finance or not, etc.
Yeah.
I think really now we have an opportunity with this moment at time for airlines, leasing companies, banks, OEMs, for all of these groups to start coming together now and say, okay, let's start looking at what the future is, because we know what's coming. What we know that's coming is objection. We know what's coming is a demand for cleaner, more sustainable. And to give you an idea on that, I asked a group of predominant millennials at a Tortoise Media event last year, and I said, if you could go across the Atlantic with existing engine technology, supersonic, and you could do it in 3 to 4 hours, or would you go and take longer to get across the Atlantic than you can now, but have zero emissions and impact on the environment? Which one would you pick? 95% of them went with the clean option. And that's interesting because that is a generational shift.
Yeah.
In my day, I lived and worked in an office where Concorde would take off from Heathrow and the afterburners would kick off above the office and all the car alarms would go off. And I'd be out there with a stupid great grin on my face because I thought it was just the most magnificent thing on the face of the planet. However, generational change. Yeah. This is now a perception where people are realizing that the world is a limited resource. And again, from that same meeting, I raised the point that prior to this, if you imagined London was served by one supermarket and the whole of London had to get everything they needed from that one supermarket, guess what's going to happen? The shelves will empty, there'll be queues, there'll be fights, there'll be all sorts of things. Now, see the Earth as that one supermarket. And if this planet that we have is the limited resource of that one supermarket, yes, climate change is the big issue. And I'm sorry, Greta, it isn't all about climate. It is basically the fact that we as the human race are just populating and consuming resource at a rate that we cannot sustain. We will consume every resource on this planet unless we start looking at situations like this and saying, we need to start doing things differently. We need to now start planning for how we do things differently. And it's these pandemics, wars, crisis, etc., that really start getting you to focus laser-like to say, how do we start to change the future? How do we really start to now bring in these technologies that mean we aren't going to have the impact? We are going to leave something for the future generations. So what better time? Now really is the time. And I think for hybrid electric, this is the point where we really do need to start pushing behind the technologies, get them out there, get people used to them, and start flying them in the next 3 to 4 years.
That's great. Great. David, obviously, during this period when we're in COVID, I am now getting to be a Zoom expert and Adobe Connect and Microsoft meetings and that. Are we going to see an impact of people getting used to this type of a remote commuting or a remote connecting world? And do we think that's going to impact the demand for aviation travel, even business travel? I would suspect that a lot of companies, as they are under additional financial pressure, they'll want to readdress whether or not they need to make that business business trip. Do you think it's going to really impact? And then just following up quickly on that, maybe you could give us a bit of a summary of what you're going to be talking about in May during the Foresight Aerospace conference.
Sure. So as it pertains to the manufacturing industry, there's not that much that can be done from home. And so at least speaking on behalf of Embraer, unfortunately, we've been in the position of having to be careful with our employees and pause some production during peak times. And so we are looking forward to when it is safe to bring back those employees, as is Airbus and Boeing and everyone that has had to do what they need to do to protect the working environment. And so from that perspective, I think that there will of course be a certain degree of resumption of normal conventional activities where people will go to work. However, I think on the other hand, I have been speaking with a few colleagues in other parts of the world where they've noticed that they've been producing the same amount with fewer employees, and they've been asking themselves, do we need to have the same structure as we had before? And do we need to have even offices at all? For those people that don't need to go to a manufacturing facility and they can do their work at home, how much do we really need to be spending on office facilities so that the cost of doing that work is or needs to remain as high as it has been? We all pay our own rent or mortgage to live in the homes we live in, and we're conducting that work, and the company doesn't pay for that. We do with our salary. And so if the company is in a position to still realize the same amount of productivity, but not have to pay for that workforce concentration in an office, I think they'd much rather do it. And so I think we're all learning right now the extent to which we can accomplish the same amount that we'd like to remotely. There is unfortunately some things that just can't be, fortunately or unfortunately, replaced with remote working. Sometimes you need to have that handshake. Sometimes it is good to be in person and to really walk through something together. And so in a post-COVID world, I think some businesses will absolutely, especially for those asset-light businesses that don't need to actually produce something in person, that work can be done remotely. I think we will certainly see a more permanent shift to remote work. And that was already the trend for a while. I think this has certainly just accelerated that. And I think that this is really actually uncovering, I think, a broad spectrum of opportunity and possibility where we can maybe even have our cake and eat it too. We can be closer to our family and still produce the same amount of great work. I know that's certainly what I'm trying to do in being at home for now, going on a month. And it seems that to one extent or another, a lot of projects, at least in Embraer and those with whom we've been working, have found a way. So I think it remains to be seen the extent to which some of these changes will be permanent, but I think that there's certainly the opportunity for us to accelerate some of those plans as an industry in terms of the amount that people really can't work from home.
Yeah.
And if you can't trust your employee to work from home, then why hire them, right?
Yeah.
We're all adults.
Yeah, exactly. So what are you going to be showing us in May at the Foresight Aerospace Conference? And of course, that's the 19th of May. So make sure you sign up for that if you're just tuning in, and we'll put up the details afterwards. But let us know, what are you going to be sharing with us?
So at this conference, what I'm very happy to share is the progress that EmbraerX and specifically the Urban Air Traffic Management project that I'm responsible for in EmbraerX has been doing over the last 9 months. And just to paraphrase what I'll be talking about in more detail, EmbraerX has 3 projects that we've been investing in: an eVTOL, of course, an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, a maintenance-based platform called Project Beacon, which is designed to reduce aircraft on ground time by using the network effect of uniting operators with mechanics to return that aircraft to service as quickly as possible. And then finally, a new paradigm of approaching air traffic management and how we use our skies, which is the project that I'm responsible for. And that essentially is taking a procedures-based approach at creating more capacity so that we really can create a more favorable operating environment for the industry to grow. And so what I'll be talking about is the various collaborations that we've been engaged with, where we've been working with several ANSPs, air navigation service providers, in both the East and the Western Hemisphere. And without saying whom specifically, I'll be able to say at a high level what we've been doing to co-create a procedures-based approach for cities that are well positioned to be early adopters of the eVTOL era of the urban air mobility industry, and how we plan on making very specific data-driven recommendations for how what we've co-created can inform the operating environment that these vehicles will be flying in. I think it's important to note, and most people don't think of it this way, which is interesting, at least from my perspective, that urban air mobility is not new. It's been around since the 40s, the launch of Los Angeles Airways, and then soon thereafter New York Airways. This is just the next chapter of what I think has mostly been a very successful story. We're really just embarking on a new generation of aircraft and the alternative sources of energy that can power that aircraft, which makes it so exciting, and that's why we're hearing so much about it. And I very much agree with Neil that this is absolutely the time to really be taking a serious look at hybrid and electric aviation. EmbraerX, of course, is investing in a fully electric aircraft. That's how we can get the noise decibels down to a certain amount of tolerance that we think most communities would be happy with, at least with intra-city travel. Of course, hybrid is a great option when we need to talk about more weight and more passengers. But this is something that we're really excited about, and I look forward to giving more detail during the 19th conference.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. Neil, any insights into what you're going to be presenting in May?
Well, I mean, hopefully, we've been busy with keeping ourselves looking at what the future holds and what do we do and how do we do it and the timelines, etc. So we've had some really interesting conversations in recent weeks, and strangely, along the thoughts that people are now starting to future plan what they want to be involved in. It's not been quite as bad as I thought it was going to be. Unfortunately, as with most startups, the greatest challenge we have right now is funding. And it was hard enough before. If anybody wants to know what it's like to set up a startup company, they know that's tough. It's a hell of a thing that you take on in your life. If you start up an aerospace company, that's even tougher. If you start up an aerospace manufacturer, frankly, you should be taken out into the garden and shot. Because you're clearly deranged. And to do that in the UK is a hugely challenging environment, because PE, private equity, VC, they just don't invest in aerospace. Yet we see in other countries like Germany, Sweden, America, etc., there is a different mindset to supporting those companies and to getting behind their local ventures, irrespective of whether they make sense or not. They will throw money at it. And it's been brutal. I mean, it has been absolutely brutal over the last 6 years, but we're still here. We're still grinding forwards the best we can. And we know the data that we have. We know what the aircraft can do. And therefore, some people have now just started to realize that. They've started to see the light bulb moment that actually maybe the first transition into the fully electric market is going to be with hybrid electric. Maybe there is some really interesting regional flight opportunity. And as David has been saying, the ability to switch the capability of your asset, as we've been saying for a while now, the fact that the aircraft can be PAX or cargo configured is huge. I mean, it's just such a key thing for the future. So yeah, I'm hopeful that by May we're going to have a couple of those announcements to make. But yeah, it's not easy. It's a struggle. There are definitely a few more grey hairs on the head. And if it wasn't challenging enough, a global pandemic on top of it, if we can survive this, we'll survive anything.
Yeah, just to make it interesting.
Absolutely.
Right. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We're well over time. Zoom have told me that we've broken up my 40-minute limit, and we're on their good graces at the moment. So quickly, I'm going to wrap up. I think we more or less agreed that we're looking between 18 and 24 months before we start seeing recovery. David, I think you're a little bit more aggressive in terms of your thoughts for recovery. People or airlines putting out those offers, and I expect probably the low-cost airline will be the first to do that. Neil, I think you definitely agreed 18, 24 months. And I think we all agree that this sub-regional electric aviation or hybrid electric aviation offers huge opportunities to help the industry recover as we lose our regional airlines, and that it is going to be a catalyst for change. Especially people getting used to the idea that there's not a lot of noise at certain airports around the world. So that's going to be, again, hopefully a catalyst for change or an opportunity to look at things a little bit differently. And of course, that we're doing this remotely means that people are going to be changing their attitudes towards their need for travel and why they should be traveling. But I think we pretty much all agree that there's always going to be a need for business type trips. And just thinking about that, I came across an odd thought. I honestly can't remember the last time I shook anybody's hand.
Interesting. Yeah,
so,
very true.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting world when we come out of this and get onto the
One
other
other
side.
thing, Darrell, I just thought of something, and this has struck me, which is basically, if you remember what happened after the shoe bomber incident, we suddenly all started having to put liquid into clear plastic bags at the airports, and that came in relatively quickly and just was mandatory. In order for the airline industry to recover quicker and faster, I think it's highly likely we're going to see mandatory mask wearing and maybe gloves. That could happen.
Yep, Harbor Air out of Vancouver, they're actually doing that. Their passengers have their temperature taken. They have masks. They clean out the aircraft, and I think Blade is actually doing this in New York as well. David was saying, where they're cleaning it down, scrubbing it up. I've just read the other day that Emirates is now implementing a 10-minute test. An actual blood sample from passengers who want to fly, plus temperature. Etihad apparently are reporting a contactless test, which I'm a bit dubious about. But anyway, we'll see what's in there. So yeah, I think that these things are going to have to be put in place to allow us to return to some form of normality, whatever the new normal may be. So. Ending on that, I've been Darrell Swanson, Director of Swanson Aviation Consultancies, and I'll be hosting the event in May with Foresight Aerospace, so please make sure that you sign up. We have Neil Cloughley, Director of Faradair, and David Rottblatt from EmbraerX. So gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Darrell.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Neil. Bye-bye.